Hello and welcome to COVIDCon. My name is Thor Halverson. I'm the founder of the Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm president of the Human Rights Foundation, and it is my privilege to welcome you here, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. We are joined by people who are piping in from across the world, not just in the audience, but also our speakers. Our speakers who have given us so much of their time, we are very grateful to. We are especially grateful to have some of the most remarkable journalists and technologists, thought leaders, and I'm especially happy to have some of the most special human rights defenders, people who have assisted in toppling dictatorships and ushering in democracies into their countries through nonviolent means, people who have risked life and limb to expose corruption and government malfeasance. As we will learn today, there are many people that are heroically struggling against authoritarianism across the world. At the Human Rights Foundation, we are devoted to popularizing the struggle against authoritarianism. And by authoritarianism, I mean both fully fledged dictatorships like, say, Cuba or North Korea, or competitive authoritarian states, places that have elections, but by and large, individual freedoms do not actually exist. If you want to learn more about those definitions, you can go to hrf.org, the Human Rights Foundation's website. Authoritarianism is at the root of the world's largest problems: poverty, war, starvation, the refugee crisis. And now, as we'll be able to appreciate, given the speakers that we've assembled and the research that they've done, the terrible coronavirus's spread. The spread of the coronavirus can be attributed both to the incompetence, the callous indifference, and the censorship of China's Communist Party. At HRF, we work very closely with dozens of Chinese dissidents and former political prisoners, survivors of the regime's oppression. Ordinary citizens who often all they did was speak out against the government or criticize the government or call for elections. And as a result of that, were met with the full might of the dictatorship. The Chinese people are some of the most innovative, hardest working, and resilient people in the history of humankind. They are also, unfortunately, the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party. Because to the Chinese Communist Party, what matters is their control of China, as well as their international image, not the lives of their citizens. It's important to remember that the same political party has been in charge in China for 70 years, in a place where there are no free elections. While the coronavirus has killed more than 100,000 people across the globe in just a few weeks, it's clear now that the choices that were made by the Chinese government have affected not just the Chinese people, but it has affected all of us. So far, 4 members of my family have been struck with the COVID-19 virus. In the worst of cases, my aunt was hospitalized at the age of 75 in a hospital in Madrid. She spent 10 days in the intensive care unit, all alone, unable to receive any visitors. We're very lucky that she has survived the disease and is back at home. But many people are not so lucky. Today is devoted largely to discussing the beginning of the COVID-19 disease and the Chinese government's role in sparking that epidemic into a pandemic, what they did and what they did not do. But it's not just the Chinese regime that has caused a lot of local and global harm through its censorship and repression. As we will see tomorrow during COVIDCon, there are other governments that we will also be talking about, most specifically the Iranian dictatorship. Through its denials and its lies, it has played a major role in helping spread the virus to Europe and in the Middle East. Governments everywhere, from Hungary to the Philippines, have used this virus as an excuse to crack down on civil liberties. And now, even in democracies, governments are introducing all sorts of emergency measures that need to be challenged. And the promise that they have, if they're not challenged, is the creation of a mass surveillance state like we have never ever seen before. After weeks of watching several journalists be expelled from China for doing their job, reporting on the news, and they were expelled by the Chinese Communist Party. And they, after watching the disinformation campaign that they've engaged in, after watching them try and engage in mask diplomacy, as well as providing all sorts of false data to the World Health Organization, data that the world relied upon and made ill-informed decisions. After that, we decided to provide some fresh voices from the front lines of independent journalism, human rights activism, and technology. The sponsor of this conference is the Human Rights Foundation, and the funding for COVIDCon comes from Fritt Ord, a Norwegian private foundation that is devoted to the protection and promotion of freedom of expression. Our first speaker today is Ian Burrell. Ian Burrell is a legendary foreign correspondent who has reported from 60 countries. He has won dozens and dozens of journalism awards. And once he provides a presentation and finishes it, we are going to go to a Q&A. So I will come back to moderate the Q&A. You can feel free to ask your questions and we will hopefully get around to them at some point. From London, I would like to welcome Ian Burrell.
Hello, welcome to London. I want to talk to you about a vampiric creature that's so small that it can't be seen with an ordinary microscope, and yet it's so powerful that it's threatening the entire global world order. Much remains mysterious, but we do know that it emerged in China, spread very rapidly to Italy, to Iran, and now threatens the entire planet with pandemonium. But what is this truth about this disease that's exploded with such devastating consequences from Wuhan, a huge city in the center of the world's most populous nation? And is China the hero of this dark hour or the villain? Did this emerging superpower demonstrate a model response to the virus with its tough tactics, as some, including the World Health Organization, would say? Or, as I and many others would argue, did Communist Party chiefs make matters worse with their crude attempts to cover up the disease, thereby delaying the global response with disastrous consequences? To answer these questions, let us turn first to a nondescript building in Wuhan, where there's a blue and white sign proclaiming a seafood market, less than a mile from one of China's busiest railway stations. This was, until recently, a bustling market, where 1,000 merchants supplied local restaurants and families. Those rows of stalls were filled with fish in crowded tanks, with crustaceans clambering out of tubs, and with counters sloppy with blood and guts. Elsewhere, there were chickens and ducks alongside dogs and dozens of exotic species, including civets and porcupines and snakes and reportedly even wolf puppies. Such wild markets are common across China. One animal rights activist said he'd visited many of them and always thought that they were like a melting pot for disease, with endangered animals stacked in cages, with dogs being bludgeoned to death, with children running around in the entrails. They're horrible, she told me. The sights, the smells, the stench, it's the stuff of nightmares. Now this was probably the birthplace of today's pandemic. Tellingly, as doctors confirm the existence of a new pneumonia-like influenza respiratory disease, the government shut the market down and, in the words of one Hong Kong expert on infectious diseases said, covered up the crime scene. It also significantly, instantly, ended wild animal trading. Of the first 41 identified cases in last December, 27 involved people who were tied to that market. Studies have shown that the outbreak began with a zoonotic transmission event, when a disease jumps from animals to human beings, and this is sadly a familiar story. We know that in 2002, SARS, another lethal type of coronavirus, emerged in China. It spread fast around the world after a hospitalized seafood seller infected some doctors and nurses. This was the first time that a coronavirus with potential for pandemic emerged, and it was blamed on consumption of civets. China slaughtered hundreds, thousands of those cat-like creatures and suspended wild animal markets in southern China. But they soon resumed. A review of studies into the outbreak that was published in 2007 found that horseshoe bats were a reservoir for these viruses, which were then amplified by civets. It concluded that the culture of eating exotic animals is a time bomb. So are we now witnessing the explosion of that predictable time bomb? Those professors at the Laboratory of Emerging Infectious Diseases even warned of the need to be vigilant for the re-emergence of SARS and other novel viruses. And now experts have again tied this new virus back to horseshoe bats from southern China. This is no surprise. Bats have been linked to 7 epidemic outbreaks over the past 26 years. But the risk of those wild animal markets was ignored, with devastating, tragic consequences. There is another suggestion that the virus leaked from a nearby laboratory that was doing investigations into bat-borne diseases, one with high biosecurity and a huge bank, the biggest in Asia, of viruses. This has not been discounted by Western intelligence. And yes, zoonotic viruses have emerged from other parts of the world. Yet what followed the eruption of these cases in Wuhan was even worse, much worse, than not closing down those markets. For rather than track the disease and control its spread, Communist Party chiefs sought instead to silence doctors, suppress data, and stifle discussion. It seems, from what we know, that the cases began to appear in the middle of November's last year, and certainly by mid-December, doctors were reporting patients coming in with coughs, with fevers, with breathing problems. They struggled to determine the cause, but they feared another SARS or similar. The worried doctors began, rightly, sharing information. The health authorities demanded details of this pneumonia of unclear causes, and China correctly notified the World Health Organization on December the 31st. But at the same time, the party swung into action to stop information seeping out. 8 doctors were detained in early January for doing their job, accused of spreading rumours. Police issued a warning against fake news. Offers from outside countries of help was ignored. And on January the 2nd, a leading scientist in Wuhan completed the genetic sequencing, which is so crucial to develop diagnostic testing and vaccines. Yet she was, say local journalists, muzzled. 8 days later, the initial sequence was posted on an open data platform by a Shanghai professor's team. His laboratory was closed for rectification 2 days later, and we know there were warnings from medical chiefs not to share data. Meanwhile, the cases began to surge, spiral, soar in Wuhan. But Chinese New Year loomed when 400 million people are on the move in China. And Communist Party chiefs had a big meeting which they wanted to protect. So officials ignored the new cases, suppressed the data, insisted the disease was controllable, and denied there was human-to-human infection. Yet that same Wuhan scientist confirmed human transmission on the 14th of January. And on the 15th, we know from reports that doctors were appearing, medics were appearing, and being treated in hospital for symptoms, which is a clear indication of human transmission. This was confirmed by a Taiwanese team sent in to investigate for their own health authorities in mid-January. Yet incredibly, an annual mass banquet for 40,000 people was allowed to take place in Wuhan on January the 18th. And it wasn't for another 2 days and this was 3 long weeks after China alerted global bodies, that the authorities began to tell the truth to their citizens and to the wider world, to the rest of us, allowing people to prepare. President Xi Jinping popped up to say the virus must be resolutely contained, and medical experts confirmed human-to-human transmission. 3 days later, Wuhan was placed in lockdown. Then other cities followed, other regions. And experts say that this cover-up, this 3-week lag at the very minimum, possibly more, was crucial because it delayed measures to isolate those with the virus, trace their contacts, prevent travel, and alert the wider world. Now, we'll never ever know for sure if this coronavirus could have been contained. But as several experts have told me, it might. It just might. It's possible that more freedom, more transparency, more openness and less repression might have thwarted this terrible pandemic that is cursing our world. Analysts blame a system that's become more centralised, more fearful under Xi, with officials scared to take decisions because they dread retribution. And we've seen this before in dictatorships, most infamously with the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union. Now, in early February, a young doctor called Li Wenliang died, leaving behind a wife and young child. He was one of those doctors who tried to warn people, but was forced to retract his misdemeanor. The death of this young doctor, who became a dissident for doing his duty, sparked a national outpouring of anger against the system. It shook the system. But as Lee said so rightly in the days before his death, a healthy society should not only have one kind of voice. In the fortnight before Wuhan was locked down, a joint study by experts in Britain, China and the US found almost 9 in 10 cases went unreported. The British Prime Minister was told, reportedly, that China was underestimating its cases 40-fold. And evidence emerged from funeral homes in Wuhan showing drastic underplaying of the number of deaths. Yet even as China unleashed these unprecedented controls on its own system, its own people, including lockdown, it lashed out at other countries who were imposing things like flight bans, accusing them of lacking goodwill. Beijing also cranked up its propaganda machine, sending hundreds of journalists into Wuhan to shape a story of national solidarity and reinforce the regime. Videos focused on the heroism of tired doctors, on nurses weeping as they shaved their heads to minimise exposure to the virus, and the army going in. And then came the usual purge, standard communist tactic, with a couple of regional officials fired as scapegoats to protect the party bosses. Alternative videos on social media showed people being welded into their homes and tied to lampposts for failing to wear masks. Married couples were even told not to share beds. One US public health official said that these were the largest public health experiment in the history of humankind. Yet there remains suspicion over the data and of inadequate testing. By early March, the country was claiming triumph, it was claiming success, that it stemmed new cases. A new party secretary in Wuhan even laughably suggested they should have a campaign, all those cooped-up residents, to hail their great chief, Xi Jinping. But the ridicule was so fierce he had to remove his post. Nevertheless, Xi was rebranded Commander of the People's War and presented as a calm balm to the rest of the world. After an unusually quiet few weeks when he ducked out of the spotlight, no doubt to avoid the heat, he stepped back into view by visiting a hospital to proclaim his triumph in turning the tide. Wuhan must be victorious, Hubei must be victorious, and China must be victorious, he was shown telling a patient. And now we see international health chiefs praising China's response and pandering to this story. Beijing sends aid to stricken nations, even if much of it turns out to be dud. And party chiefs are proclaiming a model campaign to contain and suppress the pandemic. This is not the place to argue whether the disease has been defeated. But one thing is clear, China is trying to shift its image. Partly, this is to restore national pride and prop up the party, which was shaken by the social media backlash. But China is also sending a clear message to the world that its system of government under the leadership of the Communist Party, displaying an iron grip, has defeated the virus, demonstrating the best way to handle this ghastly pandemic, to tackle disruption. And they have an ally in the World Health Organization. Yet again, this global arm of the United Nations has failed when confronted by major crisis, just as it failed with AIDS and just as it failed with Ebola. It failed this time by taking up and promoting China's narrative. Its Director General even praising China's transparency and its very rare leadership at a backslapping event in Beijing. It's refused to call out China's treatment of those brave whistleblowing doctors. It's declined to challenge China's dodgy use of data. It's not complained about exclusion of outside experts, even its own. And it went along with Chinese wishes by delaying the calling of a global public health emergency until the virus had spread to 19 countries in 4 continents. Such is WHO's appeasement of China, that it does not even recognize Taiwan, a country that offers such contrast to China with its freedoms, its democracy, and its rule of law. Taiwan first notified WHO about a new pneumonia on the same day, December the 31st, as China. But there was no reply. And as pointed out by Taiwan's vice president, himself a trained epidemiologist, an opportunity to raise the global alarm was lost. But we shouldn't be surprised. WHO's Director General, once a minister in one of Africa's worst, most repressive regimes, was levered into the post with Chinese support. He celebrated by trying to appoint Zimbabwe's tyrannical ruler, Robert Mugabe, is a goodwill ambassador, a man who'd so devastated his own country and so wrecked his own health service that life expectancy declined by 26 years at one point. Now, think tanks have accused Beijing of using global bodies to extend their global strategy, their global influence, which is a strategy which has been confirmed to me by one former Chinese official in the Foreign Office. Chinese officials have also adopted a tactic out of the Putin playbook by sowing confusion, with one Foreign Office official saying that American troops were responsible for the virus and retweeting a woman from Arkansas who said that last year's flu may have been COVID-19, really. No doubt now China will exploit the economic and political paralysis elsewhere to extend its power, having recovered first from the crisis that it caused. And there are fears that Beijing will exploit the surveillance it developed to track the disease, to increase the repression of its own citizens and export to other dictatorships around the world. One WHO official argued that China is really good at keeping people alive and complained that skeptical journalists see the nation as some kind of evil, fire-breathing regime that eats babies. No, China's leaders do not eat babies, but they do run a very repressive autocracy, one that bans families from having more than one child, one that controls citizens with the world's most sophisticated surveillance system, murders religious practitioners to harvest their organs, and locks up vast numbers, possibly even millions, of Muslim minorities in re-indoctrination camps. And they're engaged in a global struggle for supremacy that pits democracy against dictatorship. Now, these are scary times as this pandemic carves its cruel path around the planet, especially as populism also infects the West. This virus will change our world in unpredictable ways. Now, China is a great civilization. It's an extraordinary place. But look behind the lies, behind the propaganda, and behind the promotion of its stance by useful idiots. For we have just been shown how its repressive system of government hurt the people and may have harmed the wider world. So please do not be fooled. Those communist leaders in Beijing deserve to be blamed, not hailed as heroes, as pandemic courses its catastrophic course around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you.
Pleasure.
First off, I'd like to ask, I go straight to questions. This one is from Peter. I read that pangolins may have served as the bridge transmission between bats and humans. Any thoughts on this theory?
It's certainly possible. We do know that in the past, animals like civets have amplified bat viruses and aided the zoonotic transmission to humans. There have been studies that have shown that pangolin were performing a similar role in this one, but equally there's been a recent study showing actually that the human version of the virus is closer to the bat version of the virus. So the truth is we don't know. What we do know, though, is that wild animal markets such as exist in China need far, far more hygiene and far more rigor in stopping disease spreading.
Thank you. The next question is from Tommy. Do you think that Taiwan should be included as a member in the World Health Organization? And how would you think Taiwan should be entering the World Health Organization or the United Nations if it is to be done?
I think it's absolutely abhorrent that you have an independent democratic nation which is a model in many ways of freedom and rule of law and such like, and it's not allowed to participate in the international rule-making bodies. And I think it's outrageous that that the world gives in to Chinese intimidation and doesn't allow Taiwan to participate. And what we've seen with this situation is Taiwan, whose vice president is an epidemiologist, tried to warn the world and tried to tell people what was happening, but its voice was ignored. The World Health Organization didn't even reply to its original letter on the 31st of December last year. So we've seen what happens when you let tyranny overcome democracy.
Okay, now this one is from Mohammed. Should the Chinese government have pursued lockdowns earlier or not at all?
It's a good question. I think what we do know is that the Chinese government delayed taking this disease seriously, probably because of the need to have Lunar New Year take place, because of fear with local level with officials. had they pursued I'm not going to say they should have definitely welded people into their flats, but had they pursued a form of lockdown earlier, there are studies showing that between 75 and 95% of the initial cases wouldn't have been infected. Therefore, it should have taken earlier action, and it would have taken earlier action had it not been so determined to squash and suppress the information coming out.
Okay, now this one is from Chris. How is it possible to curtail behaviors that threaten global health without imposing cultural imperialism on other nations?
Well, certainly we do need to be very careful that you don't have dictates from one part of the world being imposed on the rest. And of course, we've seen that in the past. I come from Britain, which has a particularly bad track record of that. Having said that, I believe there are universal values of freedom and democracy and transparency and rule of law. And I think these are universal. I don't think that's a cultural norm. And I think that's often used by dictatorships and by supporters of autocracy to thwart essential freedoms. So to my view, we shouldn't say that the American or the British or the French way is the right way of doing something, or that the Japanese way is the right way, or the Ethiopian way is right. But what we should say is there are certain values that are universal, which are to do with decency and trust and freedom and democracy and rule of law.
So we just, the questions just keep pouring in. There are so many of them, and they're so good. I wish we had an extra hour for you to answer some of these questions. There's a ton of questions about whether you believe that this is a man-made bioweapon, if it leaked out of a lab, is it cultivated, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of them about, is it natural, is it synthetic?
Do you want me to quickly try and answer that or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think we don't know is the truth of it. I still think it looks most likely to have been somehow tied up to a zoonotic transmission, possibly tied into the market. It's certainly not impossible that it leaked in some way from one of the labs. I'm pretty skeptical about the idea that it's man-made and that it's some kind of bioweapon. I don't really go down that route. There's no evidence for that, and it does seem to be very closely allied to viruses that exist within animals. But at this stage, we don't know, and that's why it's so important that you have transparency and openness to pursue, so we can stop, not just find out about this virus, but stop future pandemics, because we can now see the damage they cause to the world.
Terrific. Thank you. Let me just, wow, again, so many questions. Do you believe that the death numbers, this is from Bernardo, do you believe that the death numbers that China reported of around 3,300, I actually think they reported more than that, something like 4, but are just part of the real numbers they hide to maintain their image?
I think there's certainly questions over the validity. It seems improbable that with the number of cases and certainly the number of deaths were as low as the Chinese authorities are saying. And we have also seen evidence from a series of funeral homes in Wuhan who have implied that the numbers were far, far higher. So I think it's very unlikely, and I'm very skeptical of those numbers.
Okay. What can Western countries do? This is from Jack. To combat propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party?
I think the first thing is to be aware of it and to not be patsy to it and give in to it and roll over. It's a very difficult situation. There's a lot to admire about China, and their way they've come out of poverty is very striking. And we do want to engage with China, in my view. But at the same time, I don't think we should roll over and just because it's becoming rich, do exactly as it says and listen to it and be bullied by it on issues like Tibet and Taiwan. We need to raise human rights abuses, and we need to be true to our own values. Otherwise, there's no point in having Western values if we don't adhere to them. So I would argue that we should definitely engage, and we should admire a lot about modern China, but at the same time, we should be critical of the Communist Party brutality. We should be critical of the denial of human rights, the surveillance society, the treatment of the Uyghurs and such like, and we should be true to our own values.
Okay, this one is from James. How does China's dictatorship response differ from the U.S. democratic response? I guess from the democratic response in general.
With regard to the virus, or what?
Yes.
Well, I think Trump has been appalling in his response to it, and there's no doubt that that's been a really bad response. We've seen better responses in places like Iceland, Germany, South Korea, not North Korea, Singapore, Taiwan have all been much more exemplary. It doesn't necessarily follow that democratic nations have the perfect response.
Got it. So it's about competence. Okay, so that is that's all the questions we're going to have time for. Thank you. Thanks very much for this.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Welcome, everyone, to today's second session at COVIDCon. I want to thank Ian for a wonderful first session and an introduction to the subject matter. We're going to be discussing the difference in the reaction between dictatorships and democracies around the world to the virus, what kind of steps they've each taken, and what we can draw and learn from this as we move forward. We have three extraordinary panelists here with me today. We're honored that they're taking the time to be here. I wanted to allow them each to give you an introduction. So I'll allow Joshua to go first. Joshua Wong,
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about yourself and what the reaction of the Hong Kong government has been.
yeah. So I'm Joshua Wong, activist from Hong Kong, and thank you for the invitation. And it's really my pleasure to share some of the update in Hong Kong. I think the success of Hong Kong in containing the spread of coronavirus was heavily due to distrust towards the Hong Kong government and China after the tragic epidemic outbreak, which means SARS in 2003. And as a result, Hong Kong people respond to the pandemic instantly with little hesitation. And with that said, the Hong Kong government was just like many countries around the world, refused to close the border connecting to China and failing to secure surgical masks and products for public use. But I would also like to emphasize that it was not until the civil society pressured the government did the government take any concrete action. In early February, public medical staff of Hong Kong went on strike, the labor strike, for a week, as to demand the government to shut down its border with China and to provide sufficient protective gear to doctors and nurses. According, the government shut down most of the border with China. And at the same time, due to the ongoing social movement in Hong Kong since last summer, there is strong public distrust against the Hong Kong government and China. And people hence take extra protective measures, including social distancing and wearing surgical masks, prior to the government making such public appeals. And the government, when the Hong Kong government did not provide the public with the necessary information to combat the coronavirus, they were unwilling to do something as simple as request the public to wear face masks at the early stage of the epidemic. Thankfully, Hong Kong people have learned that the Hong Kong government do not provide credible information and was fully aware that self-help is needed if they want to get through and overcome this coronavirus. So Hong Kong is stocked up on face mask supply and how hand sanitizers are offered in restaurant and on taxi for free. Company also encourage their staff to work from home since February. And the civil society has taken the initiative to adopt this prevention measure to minimize local infection and reduce community outbreak. Of the million of visitors who have come to Hong Kong since December, how many of them have unknowingly been in close contact with those who have contacted with coronavirus? And my observe is, apart from how people in the civil society highly engaged, the medical staff went on strike also put far more and more pressure to the Hong Kong government and to strengthen the immigration control and to seal off the border to prevent more people from entering Hong Kong in January and February. And the Hong Kong government when the Hong Kong government is not capable to lead Hong Kong out to overcome this coronavirus, but it's still lucky that 7 million Hong Kongers are aware how the situation might be more worse and how they can stand in solidarity and combat this pandemic together. And I think with such brief sharing, I would say that how even Bloomberg described Hong Kong as a failed state with such a government is not willing to governance Hong Kong and to handle the crisis. But with the strong civil society without the trust to China and Beijing, it just caught Hong Kong even under the outbreak of virus. The situation is still far more better than our imagination. So I think two critical elements that need to be emphasized. The first is whether the country is democratic or not. It will of course affect their policy and their way out to handle the virus outbreak. At the same time, whether the government and the civil society are enough sensitive on Beijing or not, which is really critical. And just like the successful case in Taiwan, and it just already showed a model that where the country really have the trust on Beijing or not will really affect their preparation in the early stage to confront such virus. And here's my brief sharing.
Thank you, Joshua. So essentially, we've all been very impressed by how Hong Kong as a society has reacted to the virus. The death totals are shockingly low, just a handful. But as Joshua was saying, perhaps the reason for that is not necessarily heavy-handed orders and decrees from the government, from Carrie Lam's government, but perhaps a decentralized, inspired response from the citizenry. So, Bethany, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you've seen, and how you would answer this question of, essentially who's responding better, to open societies or closed societies around the world?
Sure. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Bethany Allen Abrahamian, and I am the China reporter at Axios, where I cover China and also with an emphasis on China's impact in the United States and the rest of the world. So today I'm going to be talking about the work that I have done looking at how governments across Europe and also in Venezuela have addressed the coronavirus response. So I want to talk about a couple of trends we're seeing worldwide as authoritarian governments are responding to the coronavirus. And I'll go through two main trends here. And the theme here is that the coronavirus could potentially strengthen authoritarian regimes or pull borderline governments or those with some authoritarian tendencies closer to authoritarianism. So the first point is that authoritarian governments or those that lean authoritarian are tending to support each other and group together as they're addressing the crisis. This is for several reasons. Several of these countries have a history of corruption and a lack of transparency that has broken trust in the international community and left them relatively isolated. This means it's difficult for the international community to send aid because of sanctions, because of a lack of diplomatic relations, and because of a lack of trust, especially if in terms of sending actual money. Weaker regimes are looking to stronger authoritarian regimes for assistance. So, for example, Venezuela is looking to China and Russia for assistance with the coronavirus. And this is strengthening the ties between authoritarian governments. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is creating a bloc. Let me give an example, a case study of Venezuela. So Maduro is currently in power in Caracas because of a rigged election, and his government has limited diplomatic relations and has membership in relatively few international organizations, also subject to heavy sanctions. The opposition government in exile under Juan Guaido has wider diplomatic recognition, but is also not in power. They are a government in exile. That means that it is difficult for Venezuela to get international assistance. The International Monetary Fund rejected Maduro's request for $5 billion to deal with the crisis on the basis that he lacks international recognition. Organizations and nations are reluctant to send aid to Venezuela because they fear that it will just disappear, that there's no accountability, that there's so much corruption. So here is something that Manuel Avendaño, who is the director of international relations for the Juan Guaido government, this is what he told me in an interview. He said, if we don't have clear accountability and transparency to know where the money goes, we can't accept that the regime administrates this money. So because it's not able to get support from the established international community, Venezuela is leaning heavily on support from China, Russia, and Cuba. So that's the first point. My second point here is that the coronavirus is further entrenching authoritarian elements within non-authoritarian governments. For example, there is widespread health surveillance that is now completely acceptable in countries where previously it would not have been. Digital surveillance, cell phone tracking, etc. And the technology usage and social acceptance of this kind of surveillance will very likely outlast the coronavirus. In the United States, President Trump has used the nation's complete preoccupation with the coronavirus to fire 7 inspectors general, which is it's a purge that would otherwise be extraordinarily controversial, but there's just no energy here, and there's no free mental space for civil society to rise up to address that. In Europe, Chinese propaganda and mask diplomacy is providing fodder for Eurosceptic and populist politicians who are eager to hail China and to criticize the EU's response to COVID-19. So EU leaders may now have to worry about both Chinese and Russian overtures that weaken European unity. Hungary is by far the worst example of this. So at the end of March, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has spent years hollowing out Hungarian democracy, effectively killed what remained of that country's democratic institutions in a huge power grab, essentially creating the EU's first dictatorship. He suspended parliament indefinitely and got the government to pass a law that would put a 5-year prison sentence on people for spreading false information, ostensibly about the coronavirus, but it's very broadly defined. It could mean anything. And Orban has rejected assistance from the EU and has turned to China and Russia for help. So with that, I will leave it there and leave it to William.
Thank you, Bethany. I think as we discuss the differences between dictatorships and democracies, it's important to think about both their reactions kind of before a public health disaster and also after. Before, you have this idea of the cover-up, which Ian described, and censorship, and a lack of a free flow of information, which is sort of like the Chernobyl effect, if folks remember from the 1980s historic disaster in the Soviet Union. The Communist Party first tried to, essentially triggered the explosion at Chernobyl because they put loyalty to the party over the public health and the public good. And then later they tried to cover up the explosion through censorship. So this is happening in many, many, many countries around the world, as Bethany and others will talk to you about through COVIDCon. But the second thing is that governments are also using and exploiting the opportunity and the sort of the boogeyman of the virus, which is real, but they're using it as an sort of an excuse to grab more power. So these are both things we have to kind of look at. So William, tell us more about what you've seen in East Asia, and talk to us a little bit about Taiwan's response and how extraordinary it's been, if not perfect, but still something for us to be inspired by.
Right. So, hi, my name is William, and I'm the East Asia correspondent for Germany's Deutsche Welle. I have been mainly covering the coronavirus outbreak since the start in China, and then how Taiwan has been responding to it, and the global reaction to actually these two countries' response and handling of the coronavirus outbreak. I think the one key thing that really defines the differences between China and Taiwan is the word transparency, and how transparency really helped the governments to either gain the civil society's trust and compliance versus how the civil society, because of the lack of transparency, the government will have to use super heavy-handed ways to force civil society into complying with certain rules for a very extended period of time. For example, in China, in the beginning, we all know how the government in the beginning tried to hide up and conceal some of the early efforts of the local medical community in Wuhan to really inform the world and the government about the emergence of these coronavirus cases. And that really led to Wuhan having to really adopt and implement the draconian measure that we saw that lasted 76 days, where citizens basically have all their rights being stripped away from them and having to live in an unprecedented lifestyle for an extended period of time. And that created so many problems, including the distrust in the local community, in the government's ability to handle this crisis. And at the same time, the authenticity of the information that the government share with the civil society will always be viewed with a high level of suspicion, even after the lockdown has been ended just last week. Well, whereas in Taiwan, the government also took a very early initiative to respond to the rise of the coronavirus outbreak. And one of the key reasons is because of Taiwan's experience in fighting against the SARS epidemic in 2002 and 2003. That experience really led to the key decision-making and decisive strategies that the Taiwanese government has implemented, including the early intervention that they adopted by boarding onto planes that were flying into Taiwan from Wuhan to check all the incoming passengers. And Taiwan also became one of the first countries that decided to close off its border to the visitors coming from China, Hong Kong, and Macau, because it wants to be able to stay ahead of the curve of the outbreak. And that's one of the reasons why until now, Taiwan still has less than 400 cases and only 6 deaths. And, we have to remember that Taiwan and China have a very, very busy interaction on a daily basis. There are at least 500,000 Taiwanese people working in China. And when the coronavirus outbreak first started in China, that was also the period of time where hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese people are returning from China to Taiwan for the Lunar New Year holiday. So the government's intervention and also the transparency that when they roll out new measures that are supposedly going to have to ask these citizens to compromise some of their personal lives and personal rights, they use a very transparent way to explain the intention behind all these measures. And, the boundaries are also being laid out very clearly through a daily press briefing that Taiwan has been doing for the last more than 60 days. And through these daily press briefings, the civil society have been very receptive and also cooperative towards the government's measures. And this has created a very consistent basically response from both from the government side and also from the civil society side. That created a very interesting dynamic that when the government rolled out a new rule, the civil society will start to implement it, and then they will also, in a way, I don't want to use the word policing, but everyone will be reminding each other that you need to remember to follow these rules, because this is to make sure that we can continue to keep our lives as normal as possible. So with that being said, Taiwan is one of the countries that still have their schools open, running, and most of the companies are still working from the office. And interestingly, it still has the only baseball league that is currently still ongoing in around the world, whereas in the United States, major baseball league will have, unfortunately have to suspend by now. So I think these are just the key, I think, is transparency and how the government will be able to win the trust of the civil society, even when they have to roll out some unprecedented measures that will have to compromise somehow the citizens' lifestyle in some ways.
So, as William is pointing out, Taiwan is proof and evidence that we don't necessarily need a police state to fight the virus. A free and open society can tackle it in an admirable way and arguably in a world-class way. Now, I have just a short image to show you all, and it's a little bit of data. And give me 1 second. Okay. You can hear me? Okay, great. All right, so this is a chart that I wanted to show you all just to give us a very brief insight into the deaths per million statistic, which I think is something that's important to think about. So what you can see here is that obviously Taiwan and Singapore perform very well. California, the largest state in the United States, also seems to be performing quite well relative to Hubei province in China, as well as Iran and Italy, which are all doing quite poorly. So dictatorships and democracies, in context with their competency, can react to this thing in a variety of ways. But what's important to see here is that most people, when they are in a dictatorship in today's world, numerically, they're not going to be in Singapore. That's highly unlikely. Singapore is a very unique place. More likely, if you live in an authoritarian state, you're in a place like Egypt or Russia or China, or perhaps Zimbabwe or Iran, etc. So if we actually look at the numbers from these dictatorships, the ones that they give us, this data is from the governments themselves. It tells a story that seems to be competitive with democracies. But if we actually look at the numbers from dissident groups inside China and Iran, it tells a slightly different story. So if we can get the news slide. Yeah, so now these numbers are from opposition groups, right? So opposition groups in Iran tell us that 26,000 people have died. We have no way of knowing whether that's accurate. However, what we do know is that the 3,000 number that the Iranian government has given out is certainly not accurate. Is the truth somewhere in the middle? Perhaps. In Hubei province, the government says that just over 3,000 people have died. Is that accurate? Certainly not. But we don't know where the truth is. Some opposition groups on the ground have told us that as many as 40,000 people have died. Is that accurate? We don't know. But basically, the point is that if you actually see the truth inside these dictatorships, the rosy pictures they're telling the international community probably aren't so rosy. So I'd like to open that up to the panelists here. As far as this issue of, how can we even trust the numbers coming out of governments? And to give you one last example, in North Korea today, the North Korean government is reporting 0 cases, which we know to be absurd, given that its location. So maybe Bethany, maybe you want to weigh on this idea of how can we trust numbers coming out of different governments?
Well, I think it's really important to look at which government it is, and to look at the history of the data and statistics that they put forward to the world. In the case of China, initially, so after they stopped their cover-up and became far more transparent about what was happening and about their response, there seemed to be a period of time, a few weeks, where their numbers, seemed to track with what reality, could be. But that seemed to stop after they passed around 80,000. And if you look
after
at
about
charts,
February 15, right? It's like
that's
right there.
That's right, exactly. So if you look at like a graph, especially if you sort of look at the shape of China's curve compared to other countries, something really starts looking really wrong after February 15th. And I think in the months to come, we will have greater clarity as to what exactly happened and why. But it could be, for example, and this is why it's important to look at on a country by country basis. So in China, there's a Leninist system, a one-party state where there's a sort of a centralized hierarchy of power, and local officials look upwards for their legitimacy. They're not elected by the people, and so they're trying to make themselves look good. I think after February 15th, they came under a lot of pressure around the country to make it appear as though their cases were going down, or they weren't getting new cases. This is one possibility. So an important question to ask about China's case, and maybe we'll know in the future, is the data that the Chinese government, their central government, putting forward, is that the best data they have? And the problem is on the local levels, Or is there a second list and that's more accurate that they're keeping to themselves? And these are important questions when we're talking about how to evaluate it on a country by country basis. If you look at Venezuela, now they have a looming problem. They don't yet have a high number of cases, but they're not very functional. They're an authoritarian state, but they're not very functional. And so unlike China, I think it's unlikely that they would have the ability to, have a widespread, highly controlled suppression of information. Rather, they're just never going to have the testing. They're just never going to be able to get their numbers up there.
So Joshua, do you think that the undercounting in China is a good faith? It's the best we can do, or do you think there's malicious intent there, where the Communist Party is trying to tell a different story than reality?
No doubt at all how the Communist Party in China tried to provide another kind of misleading propaganda or kind of fake news widespread around the world. Especially, I think how they have the closer ties to cooperate with the WHO, and how the Director General of WHO just served the interest of Beijing and override the national pride by ignoring the global health crisis. I think is what we experience and realize. Especially one point I would like to emphasize is I remember around early February, lots of countries have been misled by the CCP false reporting and how the WHO hesitate to announce the coronavirus as a pandemic. And I think that's the critical issue to cause the pandemic to being widespread around the world, and why we need to conduct this conference by web conference is also related to the fault of CCP.
William, you've done a lot of work exposing human rights violations in the northwest part of China with religious minorities, and this is something that the Chinese government continues to deny outright. I mean, they say that there aren't any prison camps, even though we can see them from outer space. So how do you take, as a journalist, on the one hand, your knowledge that there are massive lies that this nation state continues to propagate, and on the other hand, the only data we have is the data they give us? What does a responsible media outlet do? Does the responsible media outlet share the numbers from Beijing? Does the responsible media outlet share the numbers with perhaps a caveat? I mean, how as a journalist would you hope to unpack this for people?
So I think one thing very important is going back to first Bethany's point, is that I think past track record of each government is so important for us to assess the authenticity and the trustworthiness of their numbers. And in the case of China, it's very important for us to because the reality is that the number that the government officials release are the only set of number that we can count on to start with. So it is important to share those numbers, but at the same time, whenever these numbers are being shared, it should, there should always be additional information for reminding the general public about, what happened before, and, what are some of the information that have been raised by interviews that we have done with local civil society in Wuhan and also in Hubei province, where these are the individuals that are being impacted the most, and there have been the most widespread rumors and information about how cremation centers, for example, there are in the beginning of the outbreak, there are so many cases of death that were never diagnosed properly, and they were never counted into the official death, and also a lot of the citizens were sent home even though they're already showing symptoms, because the local healthcare system is really collapsing. And what that caused is just that, it's very important for journalists to, at the same time releasing and showing the official data, but at the same time trying their best to connect with the local civil society, because in the face of an unprecedented crisis like this that is impacting, changing everyone's lives in a very fundamental way, that is when the local civil society will have an awakening moment, like what the civil society in Wuhan and Hubei had. And So
Right.
many of my interviews in the past have really told me, even after the lockdown was lifted, that they will never be able to trust the government as they were before because of the experience that they had over the last 76 days.
Well, from a human rights perspective, it seems just irresponsible for mainstream media outlets ranging from the Times to the Financial Times to be just regurgitating the data from Beijing without any caveats at all. I mean, perhaps they could use an asterisk. Perhaps they could tell their readers, hey, this is the number we have from the government, but perhaps we shouldn't trust this. Otherwise, it just makes the Chinese government look fantastic. So there is some more due diligence that can be done there. Questions from the audience. So we have not a lot of time. We're gonna focus on two main ones that I've seen here. So first of all, William, we're going to talk about surveillance and technology quickly, and then Joshua, we're going to talk about Animal Crossing. So William, even in Taiwan and South Korea, even in democracies, you are seeing governments use phone tracking and other sort of violations of individual privacy. Do you feel like this is effective? Do we need this? Have you seen actual evidence that it works? Or do you think this is something that just brings us down a slippery slope to what's happening in China, where citizens are being color coded, green, yellow, or red, and that dictates what they can do?
I think in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, it is these mechanisms are being proven to be effective in a way in the very beginning because the government of both places, they stayed ahead of the curve. So that is why they were able to use the surveillance technology and also methods to track down all these possible people contracting or carrying the virus. But once and set the boundaries very clearly so that there will not be pushbacks from the civil society. But at the same time, in Taiwan, for example, the government is using the name of communicable disease like this to pass a lot of the laws that in a way is giving the government a lot more power than usual. So I think it is in the conscience of the government and the president and the administration itself to balance that, walk that very fine line of making sure that they are always passing these in the sense that it is purely for controlling and preventing the disease from spreading, rather than giving its administration more power for a longer term. So I think the government just needs to keep that in mind while they're using these methods to fight. Yeah.
Let's be very careful. I mean, look, there's no independent scientific studies that have proven that digital contact tracing or phone surveillance have been the difference maker, as opposed to things like hand washing, masks, social distancing, public education, etc. So let's just be very careful. I mean, again, or else we're going to start to head in a direction where the public is normalized and, basically okay with mass surveillance. So there's something that needs to be done here to as journalists and activists, where we need to help challenge these claims by governments that this stuff is necessary. Let's actually see the effectiveness. Singapore, which is a surveillance state, is heading in the wrong direction. And of course, Joshua, in China, in the world's largest surveillance state, which has the most sophisticated surveillance in the history of humankind, they couldn't stop the virus, and it's brought tremendous economic destruction to the government. So that should teach us a thing or two about mass surveillance and its effectiveness. So just to close, we couldn't do this panel, Joshua, without you telling us a little bit about Animal Crossing, given that your protest in this Nintendo video game has taken the world by storm. Tell us just very briefly what happened and why you are using this video game as a tool for awareness to help promote freedom in Hong Kong.
Animal Crossing is the game that allow players to freely decorate the island, and lots of Hong Kongers just transformed their island to be a protest site. And with those slogans just like 5 demands, no one less, and free Hong Kong. And with the political censorship in China, Beijing just decided to ban this game. And because of some of the players in Hong Kong use this game as one of the platform to gather user and to show some of the political demand. Which is really ironic, is no one could imagine such Animal Crossing game just building your island, and it's the game that no matter from kindergarten to high school or elderly, everyone in different age group, they will play this game, but it's still being censored out by China. And I think this issue also caused lots of attention around the world. No matter Reuters or a lot of the international media report it, And I wonder in the upcoming future, once I decided to play any games and promote on Twitter, that game might ban in China. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up here, but it's amazing that the government that many people in the West are saying, hey, we should follow more closely. Let's remember, this government is censoring video games, is censoring creativity, is preventing people from collaborating with each other, is locking up millions of people in prison camps, is orchestrating the world's largest surveillance state. We should be very careful about these heeds and suggestions to be more like the Chinese Communist Party. And remember, if you can take anything from this session, think about Taiwan, think about all these democracies around the world that have handled the virus, like New Zealand, like Iceland, like so many others, that haven't had to go to heavy-handed measures, that haven't stripped freedom from their people, that have done so in a way that is open and transparent. We don't need a police state to fight the virus, would be the conclusion. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
And we look forward to the rest of COVIDCon.
I'm Yang Jianli, and I'm grateful for your time. I would like to start my presentation with a video seen all across China.
脚步不曾停下，多少次付出，不图报答。扬起的风帆，不怕海深浪大。这有你有我有他，有一阵阵心梦。
The Chinese Communist Party propaganda video you have just seen was distributed on February 22nd, when the coronavirus was killing thousands of people every day in China. The people of Wuhan were still in lockdown, yet the video pretends that Wuhan residents were fine and thankful to the government, which was doing everything possible to save them. The Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlai I'm Yang Jianli, and I'm grateful for your time. I would like to start my presentation with a video seen all across China.
脚步不曾停下，多少次付出，不图报答。扬起的风帆，不怕海深浪大。这有你有我有他，有一阵阵心梦。
The Chinese Communist Party propaganda video you have just seen was distributed on February 22nd, when the coronavirus was killing thousands of people every day in China. The people of Wuhan was still in lockdown. Yet the video pretends that Wuhan residents were fine and thankful to the government, which was doing everything possible to save them. The Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan made an inspection trip to a Wuhan residential complex on March 5th. Here is a video showing her walking through the grounds of complex.
你好，谢谢你，共产党万岁！
谢谢。
伟大的祖国万岁！
谢谢你们支持。
Please watch it once more and more carefully.
你好，谢谢你，共产党万岁！
Here you are. The man was played by a cop. Here is another video of the same scene captured by real residents.
家里，那么用群众保障人才，假的，什么都是假的。
Sun Chunlan's inspection was to test the waters to prepare for the later visit of the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping. After Sun Chunlan left, Wuhan Party chief Wang Zhonglin suggested citizens to undergo gratitude education to properly thank the party and Xi Jinping for saving them in the epidemic, so that Xi Jinping's later visit could appear more triumphant. Here is the propaganda video of his visit.
你们辛苦了，你们辛苦了。 看将来
You can see images of Xi Jinping as a great and a conquering leader to whom the people should be thankful. To ensure everything was real this time, each family in the area where Xi Jinping walked through had 2 security officers sitting in their homes while Xi Jinping was walking down there, so that nobody would dare express their anger and frustration or point out that everything is faked. Xi Jinping's regime does not want Wuhan residents to tell you how much they have been suffering and how the disaster befell on them. While Xi Jinping was staging his visit, endless Wuhan residents pleaded for help online, saying hospitals were overflowing and their family members were turned away and left to die at home. Nobody knows how many people died before managing to get to hospitals and how many people died without their loved ones around. During that time, photos circulated on the internet showing people lying in the street in Wuhan, dead or fainted. And numerous photos also displayed that those who violated quarantine orders or showed symptoms were either forcibly removed by local police from homes or forcibly imprisoned inside their homes. Those who did not wear masks in public were shamed publicly and beaten up. There are obvious clues that the Chinese government is concealing the extent of virus outbreak and its casualty in China. On March 23rd, the government authorized the family members to collect the ashes of the dead in Wuhan for 12 days, during which 35 urns were handed out each day. Totally, that's 42,000 deaths. The number is in a shocking discrepancy with the official Wuhan tally, that is 2,524. More than 15 times more people died than officially admitted. The evidence reveals a level of negligence that is criminal. My organization, Citizen Power Initiatives for China, spent weeks creating a detailed timeline of the events. It can be reviewed and analyzed at wuhanmemo.com. The first recorded case in Wuhan was November 17, 2019. The authorities waited more than 2 months to shut down the city on January 23, 2020. In December, several Chinese laboratories identified a mystery infectious virus. On January 1st, the authorities demanded the destruction of the lab samples and the stop of the testing for the virus. Despite multiple cases of transmission, they denied human-to-human transmission until 3 weeks later. On December 31st, the eye doctor Li Wenliang and 7 other doctors, all from Wuhan Central Hospital, started blowing the whistle. They were quickly reprimanded by the authorities for propagating rumors. The state-controlled media doubled down by publicly humiliating them, claiming the doctors were stirring up trouble and deserved punishment. Dr. Li Wenliang died of the virus on February 7th. The second whistleblower, Dr. Mei Zhongming, died of the virus on March 1st. We have been unable to determine the fate of the other 6 whistleblowers. It is undeniable that the Chinese government prioritized covering the virus instead of addressing it immediately. Its dangerous and selfish behavior has led the controllable outbreak to become a global pandemic, killing hundreds of thousands and plunging the entire world into a total catastrophe. This public health crisis has exposed Xi Jinping's totalitarian politics. Since he took power in 2012, Xi Jinping has struck fear into intellectuals, journalists, and private business people. The message is clear and simple: loyal or face punishment. Censorship used to be fragmented across the government agencies, with cracks that nimble journalists and netizens could exploit to circulate information. Now, the space for free speech and civil society has been squeezed almost to zero, turning back to the time of the cultural revolution. Inside the party, officials are told to be absolutely loyal to Xi Jinping and never question his policies. This keeps the government official in line and at the same time cripples their ability to govern. There are no incentives to blow the whistle on anything that is wrong. This creates the perfect storm for a pandemic. As a result, when the coronavirus broke out, no one in the government would dare suggest, against Xi Jinping's will, that he must act immediately and urgently. A state-run journal revealed that Xi Jinping knew about the epidemic on January 7th. And on that day, at the Politburo meeting, Xi Jinping gave a comprehensive order for the government's response. We don't know exactly what the order was, but from the government's actions in the next 2 weeks, we can deduce that at the core of the order was an extensive cover-up for the sake of stability. Otherwise, given his power in China, these government actions would be unthinkable. During that time, for example, in Wuhan, both the city government and the provincial government convened 1,200 people meetings. The local government then organized a 40,000 family banquet to celebrate the Chinese New Year. More outrageously, on January 23rd, the day when the Wuhan lockdown was declared, the People's Daily newspaper did not mention the lockdown, but instead headlined the news that Xi Jinping hosted a grand New Year party, at which he did not mention a word about Wuhan or the virus outbreak. The death of Li Wenliang unleashed people's anger toward the regime. The voice for free speech is strong and eager. Many heroes have since emerged to challenge the regime. I will introduce but a few of them here. Xu Jiangrun, a Tsinghua University professor, was put under a house arrest after posting online an article entitled "The Angry People Are No Longer Afraid," in which he declared that the coronavirus has exposed the bankruptcy of the China's rulers and that democracy is the only way out. Xu Zhiyong, a major leader of China's citizen movement, was arrested after calling for Xi Jinping to step down. Chen Qiushi is a lawyer and a citizen journalist who has covered the 2019 Hong Kong protests. He disappeared after documenting and reporting the true situation in Wuhan. Ai Fen, the head of emergency at Wuhan Central Hospital, went public saying authorities had stopped her and her colleagues from warning the world about a virus outbreak. She has disappeared. Ren Zhiqiang, a property tycoon, wrote that Xi Jinping is a power-hungry clown and that his strict limits on free speech had exacerbated the epidemic. He is detained along with his assistant and his son. The Chinese Communist regime and its leader, Xi Jinping, are not saviors in this pandemic. They are the culprits. They put power and control above human lives. China has for years claimed to be a responsible member of the global community. But with this pandemic, it has revealed its true colors. It can no longer be denied that Xi Jinping's regime is a danger to the world. The leaders of democratic countries must hold the Chinese state accountable for this global pandemic and its economic consequences. If they don't, then we, the civil society, must push them to do so. Do not let Xi Jinping's regime get away with what it has done to you and your loved ones. Do not let the Chinese dictatorship control the Wuhan virus narrative to its advantage. We must not let the culprit play the savior. I also ask you for solidarity with the people in China suffering under Xi Jinping's dictatorship. I started off with a propaganda video. I would like to end with a 2-minute talk by a resident of Wuhan who perfectly illustrates what Professor Xu Jiangrun said. The angry people are no longer afraid. Let's hear the people sing.
同胞，因为武汉这个事情，武汉这个瘟疫，都是有计谋、有计划发出来这个瘟疫，牺牲的是我们平民老百姓，我的家人、我的父母在家等死，没有人关心我们平民老百姓的性命，有钱也买不到药，有钱也买不到病房。然后香港同胞，你们独立我支持，台湾独立我也支持，西藏、香港独立都支持，摆脱共产党的邪恶手爪，腐败的政权，邪恶的社会，没有一个人可以自由发声，没有一个人，只有一个人自由发声，就去警察局喝茶、拘留、判刑，法律是他们判的，他们能说判几多年就能判几多年，律师都没有用的，有一个正义的律师都会关起来，他不会为正生而说话，因为他们有邪恶的政权压迫下不能正的说话。我要告诉你们，一个人牺牲，2个人牺牲，革命肯定是有血有肉来牺牲。我想站出来，我暴露出来，我就要站出来，我就要牺牲，为我的父母，为我的家人，为我以后的后代可以自由的生活。我发声，我也很危险，我也知道，但是我已经受不了了。没有病床，没有医药， CCTV 讲的那个新闻全部都是假的，全部。他们的吼声，他们的叫声，我看到了。我要发声，我要为我自己发声，我要为我武汉的人民发声，我要为中国同胞发声。就是有养老金，他们想把这个养老金废掉，搞这些事情。这种邪恶的政权，我真的不想再真的不想再沉默了。我要发声了，我要疯了。没有一个人可以站出来，我现在站出来了，一定要反抗，一定要反抗啊！同胞们，不能再让他们宰割期呀，咱不能再可以这样了。为了下一代站起来，真的是站起来呀！
Thank you, Dr. Yang Jianli, for your powerful presentation, highlighting how the Chinese Communist Party's incompetence and state censorship really served as the catalyst of this global pandemic. My name is Jenny Wang from the Human Rights Foundation, and I will be moderating this Q&A panel discussion here with you all today. We have about 10 minutes on the clock, so let's get started. Okay, first question from Simone. Did the Chinese virus get to other places in China, such as Beijing, or was it only in the Hubei province?
Thank you, Jenny. That's a very good question. The Wuhan virus outbreak actually has gone to everywhere in China, not only restricted to Hubei province. It has gone to Beijing, Canton, Shanghai, and everywhere in China.
Thank you. Next question from Felix. What is a concrete measure that we can do to increase awareness of the CCP's responsibility?
I think this conference like this will do a wonderful job to let more and more people in the world to know what Xi Jinping's regime did in the first 2 months of the Wuhan virus outbreak. To know the regime's callous, dangerous, selfish, and brutal behavior in handling this virus. That actually has resulted in a global crisis we are experiencing now. So this conference, and we have a social media, and we can use the social media. And if you could, I would suggest you to write articles about it and do good research on it, and put together this kind of virtual conference to let more and more people to get to know the facts.
Mm-hmm. Great ideas. Amanda has a question. Are there any updates on what has happened to the disappeared?
We have been unable to determine the fate of so many people who have emerged to challenge the regime ever since the Wuhan virus broke out. And we don't know whereabouts of Xu Zhangren. We don't know the whereabouts of Xu Zhiyong, Chen Qiushi, Fang Bin, Li Zehua. These are, we call citizen journalists who who have been documenting and reporting about the true situation in China. And we don't know where Feng is. She is a doctor. She went to public telling the truth. Now she disappeared. And Ren Zhiqiang, we know, is detained, but we don't know where he's detained. And so many cases like that are happening in China.
At the end of your presentation, you showed us a very, very strong video of a woman begging the audience and the viewers to understand what's going on in China. Nicolina has a question. She wants to know, will this woman in the video survive after showing what's going on worldwide?
Yes, we all concerned about her safety. But unfortunately, again, we have no information whatsoever where she is, and how she's doing. And the Chinese Communist Party regime uh, has not changed the behavior from the lesson of Dr. Li Wenliang. Instead, they doubled down on controlling the information, on censoring. So it's very difficult to find where these people are. And we really concerned about their safety. And what we can do here is to enlarge their voices. I call the people's voice out of anger and frustration as a turning point where the fury overcame the fear. Just like what Professor Xu Zhangming said, the angry people are no longer afraid. I predict more and more people will come out to speak out. But we in the international community must show our solidarity with them to come up with a concerted effort to support them.
Yes, absolutely. Regina has a question. Why would they hide the virus instead of treating it? What benefits would they have of doing that? Okay, seems like we're having a few technical difficulties, but we're going to try to get him back on. Please continue leaving questions. We'll address them right away. Hopefully everyone's enjoying COVIDCon so far. If you haven't done so, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Human Rights Foundation. And hashtag this conversation. Keep the conversation going. Hashtag COVID. All right. Well, we're really grateful to have Dr. Yang join us for our first COVIDCon. His speech was really compelling and very important. We're out of time for this session, but please keep this conversation going. It is so crucial for us all to side and have solidarity with the Chinese people. As I mentioned earlier, follow Human Rights Foundation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Use hashtag COVIDCon. We will now have an intermission break. Take this time to stretch a bit, grab some food. We'll be back in 30 minutes and have a conversation with Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei. Thank you for joining.
What you wear, your fashion, is part of your everyday life and can serve as an outlet for self-expression and creativity. Usually, people's fashion aims to make them more appealing, desirable, and pleasant. What you wear can even reflect your culture, beliefs, political views, and values. Fashion can be a tool for change and has proven to be an important part of the struggle for human rights around the world. Women's rights advocates protested the oppressive hijab laws in Iran by wearing white headscarves and white clothing. These brave women launched the White Wednesdays movement, encouraging women to display freedom from the hijab. In Malaysia, pro-democracy activists who wore yellow t-shirts in support of the Bersih opposition movement were arrested in 2015. Wearing the Bersih t-shirt or any yellow clothing was banned by the government. In Havana, Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, gather every Sunday to bring attention to the lack of freedom in Cuba. They are the mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives of political prisoners. They dress in white and carry flowers. For their protest performances against Vladimir Putin, the famous punk rock group Pussy Riot wore brightly colored balaclavas. Their arrest, trial, and false imprisonment led to widespread protests around the world, with thousands of people wearing the colored balaclavas in a show of support and as a way to reject Putin's dictatorship. Ivan Mawarire, a civil rights advocate from Zimbabwe, made a protest video wrapping himself in a Zimbabwean flag. The video inspired a movement both online and offline, with Zimbabweans wearing their flag as a symbol of protest against the tyrant. In response, the government passed a law punishing those who wear the flag with a 1-year prison sentence. These recent examples are just a handful of instances where self-expression through fashion serves as a nonviolent and unifying tool of resistance. We invite you to stand out against tyranny and wear your values.
그리움과 뜨거운 경모의 정을 담아 위대한 김일성 동지와 김정일 동지께 가장 숭고한 경의와 새해 인사를 삼가드립니다.
There's a new and unconventional effort
to get information into North Korea
by sneaking information into the country on USB drives.
Human rights activists are now collecting old USB sticks, urging people to donate their old flash drives by popping them in these slots.
Pack it with information, whether it's Wikipedia,
movies, TV shows, ebooks,
in a bid, obviously, to undermine the regime's lies and propaganda, which it feeds to its own people every single day.
To open up their eyes to the fact that there is a world outside what they've been led to believe.
And if you think about it, that is very dangerous for Kim Jong-un, because if people get a sense that the image of America that he has carefully painted for them is false, he could have huge problems.
김정일 동지께 큰소를 위한 투쟁에 고귀한 생을 바친
We believe that freedom of information is a fundamental right. Without accessing information, it's impossible to form your own consciousness.
Of course, watching this information helped me to realize there was some humanity out there.
If we continue and expand our activity of disseminating information to educate North Korean people in the long run, I'm absolutely sure that North Korean people one day would stand up to change the course.
For the past 10 years, the Oslo Freedom Forum has been uniting the world to stand against tyranny. Dissidents and rights advocates from around the world gathered once again with artists, entrepreneurs, journalists, philanthropists, and technologists to trade strategies and inspire action to combat the worst human rights violations across the globe. Together, they have become the thorn on tyranny's side.
Tyrants are afraid of the people. They have seen the power of peaceful, organized movements time and time again.
Crimes against humanity and democracy cannot coexist.
Nothing brings democracy except for the people who care about it and decide upon it as a value and work for it and take risks.
Collectively, we know more than any individual isolated alone.
This is where we really have a community. This is where we build the sense of family.
I want you to be outraged, and I want you to act.
What is freedom after all? The ability to imagine what is better and to project it into the future and to make that future.
Let us rise up against tyranny. Let us rise up against dictatorship. And let us ensure that we leave the world a better place than we made it.
What you wear, your fashion, is part of your everyday life and can serve as an outlet for self-expression and creativity. Usually, people's fashion aims to make them more appealing, desirable, and pleasant. What you wear can even reflect your culture, beliefs, political views, and values. Fashion can be a tool for change and has proven to be an important part of the struggle for human rights around the world. Women's rights advocates protested the oppressive hijab laws in Iran by wearing white headscarves and white clothing. These brave women launched the White Wednesdays movement, encouraging women to display freedom from the hijab. In Malaysia, pro-democracy activists who wore yellow t-shirts in support of the Bersih opposition movement were arrested in 2015. Wearing the Bersih t-shirt or any yellow clothing was banned by the government. In Havana, Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, gather every Sunday to bring attention to the lack of freedom in Cuba. They are the mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives of political prisoners. They dress in white and carry flowers. For their protest performances against Vladimir Putin, the famous punk rock group Pussy Riot wore brightly colored balaclavas. Their arrest, trial, and false imprisonment led to widespread protests around the world, with thousands of people wearing the colored balaclavas in a show of support and as a way to reject Putin's dictatorship. Yvonne Mawarire, a civil rights advocate from Zimbabwe, made a protest video wrapping himself in a Zimbabwean flag. The video inspired a movement both online and offline, with Zimbabweans wearing their flag as a symbol of protest against the tyrant. In response, the government passed a law punishing those who wear the flag with a 1-year prison sentence. These recent examples are just a handful of instances where self-expression through fashion serves as a nonviolent and unifying tool of resistance. We invite you to stand out against tyranny and wear your values.
Stands on the brink of disaster.
Police opening fire on protesters.
I know that freedom of speech is not about revolutions, not about throwing out your corrupt and authoritarian presidents. Freedom is a daily exercise, the daily choice of which side you are taking. And if you are neutral in the situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor.
This is not about statistics. When we talk about 100,000 of displaced people, not statistics. It's human beings. They deserve peace, they deserve dignity. And they only count on people like you.
Human rights activists and dissidents in different parts of the world, they may often feel alone. And HRF is able to bring them together so that they see that the struggle is often a shared one.
Profoundly, humanly, it's about connection. I need a community of people that have been tortured, have been behind bars, that their home was taken away from them. So I can go to them and I can ask them, I can seek their advice.
We spend a lot of time discussing how we can practically make places safer, get people's stories out, fight the good fight.
Hack North Korea, organized by the Human Rights Foundation, brought 100 engineers, coders, activists, investors, and designers to get information into and possibly out of North Korea, airdropping a different kind of weapon, knowledge.
You see people who live in free societies actually coming genuinely to see how they can help others also become free in their own societies. And that's an opportunity that I am extremely grateful HFF has given me.
Our brain rewards us for extending our hands towards those in need. Perhaps the answer to the epidemic of anxiety and despair of our age is actually to extend our compassion. The future of freedom is the future of creativity, the future of our tools, the future of social impact, the future of positively affecting 1 billion people.
HRF has become that support system we've been looking for a while.
We're all connected. You are really fighting for humanity. Once we understand that, it's never us and them. It's all of us.
HRF is this extraordinary universal knitting machine that knits us all together.
What we're trying to do is link people throughout the world to know that they can have and make a difference. It's only when we choose to do this and put ourselves from empathy into compassion that we will actually be able to move the powers that be to do something similar.
그리움과 뜨거운 경모의 정을 담아 위대한 김일성 동지와 김정일 동지께 가장 숭고한 경의와 새해 인사를 삼가드립니다.
There's a new and unconventional effort
to get information into North Korea
by sneaking information into the country on USB drives.
Human rights activists are now collecting old USB sticks,
urging people to donate their old flash drives by popping them in these slots.
Pack it with information, whether it's Wikipedia,
movies, TV shows, ebooks,
in a bid, obviously, to undermine the regime's lies and propaganda, which it feeds to its own people every single day.
To open up their eyes to the fact that there is a world outside what they've been led to believe.
And if you think about it, that is very dangerous for Kim Jong-un, because if people get a sense that the image of America that he has carefully painted for them is false, he could have huge problems.
김정일 동지께 큰소를 위한 투쟁에 고귀한 생을 바친
We believe that freedom of information is a fundamental right. Without accessing information, it's impossible to form your own consciousness.
Of course, watching this information helped me to realize there was some humanity out there.
If we continue and expand our activity of disseminating information to educate North Korean people in the long run, I'm absolutely sure that North Korean people one day would stand up to change the course.
And now we are going to shift gears and have a conversation with Chinese artist and human rights defender Ai Weiwei, a man who honestly needs no introduction.
Hi, sure.
Weiwei, thank you very much for joining us at COVIDCon. The last time I saw you was at the Sundance Film Festival in January, and this got me thinking for this interaction. Thousands of people came together at Sundance to watch narrative films and documentary films. Art flourishes in so many ways in democracies, and it plays a vital role in keeping those democracies honest, in challenging civil society, in challenging the ruling apparatus, and in challenging government. In democracies and free societies, art typically can find resources, it can find room to grow and develop. Art is absolutely key for the health of a nation. Do you believe that art can flourish in the society that Xi Jinping is building in China?
Art plays a very crucial role in society. And in China, under current very strict censorship, art is never really functions as art should be. There's a strong censorship for different opinion, and therefore there's almost no imagination, or there's no space for imagination and creativity.
Well, that's very sad. What is it like to be a Chinese dissident that is silenced by the Communist Party in China?
Well, when artists in a society which facing such a strong censorship, simply it doesn't function that well. My case is I have been completely been erased from any kind of media, including internet. And also physically I have been facing police brutality, and also has been put in detention, and also they use all kind of possible means to dirt my name. So it doesn't really function if you in this kind of society you're in constant isolation, and you have no means to express yourself.
Well, that's a very painful and sad truth you've just told. It's the crushing of the human spirit that you've outlined. And unfortunately, so many authoritarian governments are devoted to that. Well, some of the speakers we have here at COVIDCon have said that censorship has played a key role in the spread of the coronavirus pandemic in China, that it could have been stopped, could have been prevented from spreading into a pandemic. What is your view of the role of censorship and fear in the last few months and how it has impacted society as a whole?
I think a healthy society would allow freedom of speech. In this condition, the society can cope very complicated issues. We need a free flow of information and communication. But what happened in China is very centralized control of all media and information. So nobody can clearly know or understand what is really happening. So that would, to facing coronavirus when it's just started, they really censored those doctors who knows the situation, and the state media not really reporting what is the truth about the infection and the hospital situation. That gave a quite long period of time. People completely don't know what's going on, and it gave the virus a chance to be very widely spread. And till today, we still don't know what is the real situation happening in China. All the numbers seems completely fake, and it doesn't relate to any kind of logic conclusion of this disease. First, where those diseases really come from, the virus, where it's really come from, how it's being spread, and what is the real situation. All those things are so unclear. That lead to a global neglectance about this disease. WHO also worked in China's favor, and trying to somehow to not to really give the clear sight about the seriousness of the problem. So we can see freedom of speech, which is very crucial. It functions in this modern society. It's not just a rights, but also it relates to live or death to a society.
True. Well, along those lines, in discussing freedom of expression, earlier today, one of our presenters was able to gather some videos of what regular citizens were saying in Wuhan. And in one of these videos, a woman is engaging in some unthinkable condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party, with very dramatically strong views attacking the government. The people of Wuhan seem angry and betrayed. Do you think that what's happening in China is going to have a profound and lasting impact in terms of potentially sparking perhaps a seed of dissent, a seed of change there?
During this whole coronavirus crisis, there are a lot of anger or a lot of desperate emotions being expressed by the people in Wuhan or the people in even small intellectual circle. But that is not worries the Communist Party. During past 70 years, there's always intellectuals or always a critical voice somewhere, even it's very little, but still they can easily just make it disappear. They can put people in jail without trial. They can make people disappear. And my case, they just have to kick me out from my nation. So that would not really shaking them, and that would not really they control the whole situation. It's not possible. Only thing could shake them is their own performance. If they still can perform in the international stage without not truthful and without not showing a legal leadership and legitimate leadership, and also to have the trust of the international community. And this would really be questionable, and for their control and for their performance.
What is it like to be an independent-minded individual in China? What is it like to think differently from the Communist Party of China?
I think to be an individual mind or to be a critical voice, that means it's just like a suicide in China. It's not possible, and the government knows it well, and they control it very well. So basically, there's no clear voice like that. Recently, several people raises the question in very high level, and immediately they are being put in jail, and they will disappear. And the majority of people would not even know what those people are talking about.
That is a very powerful and heartbreaking way of communicating what it's like to have a free mind in China. It's also a reminder to those of us who are privileged to have been born or to live in free nations to do our utmost and bear our civic duty to keep them free, and also to help those who live in tyranny achieve their own freedom. So thank you for that. Thank you. I want to follow that up with what do those of us who don't speak Chinese and are not in China, what are we missing? What are we unable to see that those who are local or speak the language are able to appreciate?
I think China has been an issue for international community and will continuously play a very strong impact in global economy or politics, especially after this coronavirus crisis. International community should be aware the possible crisis China can create for the human society. And I think in general, the West, people living in the West, they couldn't care less. People doesn't really understand China, and they don't care about who they're dealing with, as long as they have a business, as long as the situation it doesn't affect the situation in the West. But this crisis made it a little different because there's no place you can hide. Doesn't matter you're in the United States, England, or France, or Germany. We all, globally, we all facing the impact of what is wrong, and when we really clearly examine what is wrong, it has to be warning about China's way of performance, their way of handling the situation, and the transparency and honesty, and how they deal with the legitimacy of a communist party.
Outside of China, there is what's clear a coordinated and industrial-sized effort to portray the Chinese regime as having taken the right and necessary measures to stop the spread of the virus. Meanwhile, inside China, there is even talk of enrolling the citizens of China in gratitude education towards Xi Jinping for the decisions he made. What is your view, both of the international campaign to portray China that way, as well as the internal measures that they are taking in terms of propaganda to heap praise on the dictator?
I think what internationally or even current government, they're trying to erase the factual, which cost thousands of people's life, and also almost like subversive to the modern establishment. And I think the reason is people really want the business to go back as normal, and there's so many people they need China, and China also need the global business, and they want everything to be as normal as possible. So I think this is a purely propaganda, and that only means there will be another crisis come very soon. I don't think this is a situation we can just simply ignore, or to not to give the clear truth and a clear argument. So I think this is only a sign of another failure.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I have one last question for you. I have to say I'm sorry, but some of you have been concerned about Yang Zhanli, and if you tuned in to the session before the Q&A with Ai Weiwei, you noticed that toward the end of the session, Jenny was unable to finish asking him a couple of questions. I have to say I'm sorry, but some of you I just spoke with Yang Zhanli, and I'm going to get him on the telephone because his computer has been attacked. So, let's see.
Hello.
Hi, Zhanli. I have you on my FaceTime, and I wanted to have everyone interact with you with regard to what has just happened at the end of your very powerful presentation at COVIDCon about the situation inside China. So could you fill us in? And if people can't hear, I'll repeat what you just said.
Okay. So, but toward the end of the question answer session, I was attacked. my computer crashed. That would be like if you want to speak out in China. They always try to shut you up. I'm here in the United States. I'm safe, but they still try to do everything possible to shut me up. But I will tell you, I will not shut up. I will continue to speak out. As what Dr. Ivan said when she was interviewed by People magazine in China, she said, if I had knew so many people would die, I would not shut up myself. I will continue to speak out. I will speak out as much as I can. So that's my mentality now. I will speak out as much as I can.
Now, it's a little shocking. You know, we're having our conference. We're sitting in the United States. You're in Washington, D.C. People are piping in, and we weren't expecting that one of our speakers would essentially have his computer attacked during this event. Can you tell us exactly what happened physically, and hopefully we can hook you up with some folks maybe from Citizen Lab or somewhere else to figure out how this attack happened and maybe protect you and figure out a way of helping you recover the data on that computer.
Yep, I was trying to answer the fourth question put forth by Jenny, and all of a sudden the screen just went out. And then I tried to turn it on, and I tried, and I have been trying ever since, but I have not been able to turn it on. So I'm not a technical person. I don't know what happened, but everybody understand the behavior, the mindset of the Chinese Communist Party regime. They want to shut up everybody. So this kind of thing happened to me many times in the past. When, for example, we put together a conference for memorizing Tiananmen Square massacre, and they would happen. And it happened many times in the past, so I'm not surprised.
Well, I think I should tell some of the people who are joining us that you actually were one of the original Tiananmen Square protesters, and that you spent years in prison in China as a result of simply asking for democracy in China. And I salute you for this. I salute you for continuing the struggle, not only after prison, but after prison, you decided to continue this. Your organization is Citizen Power Initiatives, and you've created a website called the Wuhan Memo. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, WuhanMemo.com. It's a detailed timeline of the events. If you study the timeline, you will see very clearly who is responsible for this global pandemic.
Well, Jean-Li, thank you. I wanted to make sure that the people who joined us had a chance to, in many ways, figure out what happened, because some people were rather concerned what happened to Dr. Jean-Li, what's going on. He just disappeared. And I guess we're all living through some of the technical difficulties of working from home and some of the issues having to do with quarantine and broadband and issues like this. But certainly we never expected that your computer would stop functioning and does not work any longer. So again, I salute you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your leadership. Everybody stay safe, healthy, and hopeful. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, well, that was certainly unexpected. And I guess a powerful reminder of the fact that some people who engage in this sort of work, sometimes this machine of repression can reach out. I think it's a bit of a coincidence that this happened. Now, from a technical standpoint, if you are joining us and you've enjoyed it so far, please continue and let your friends know about COVIDCon. I think if sometimes you're having trouble with the live stream, just reopen the window or start it up again. I think so far it's been technically okay. We have a limited staff everyone is working remotely, so we're trying to put this conference with the highest production value possible. So I'll move on to the next session. I'm so grateful to have had an opportunity to interact with Ai Weiwei. I'm now going to introduce a session in which a conversation will take place about China's economic dominance in the world and what that means for human rights. The conversation is going to be led by a friend of mine, Melissa Chen. She is the managing director of a nonprofit in New York called Ideas Beyond Borders. And she is in conversation with Kyle Bass of Hayward Capital Management. I think that there will be, if they're not online yet, they're about to join us. And again, thank you very much for joining us at COVIDCon. We're delighted to have you. Thank you for joining the struggle and for finding out more about the struggle against authoritarianism. So we go now to Melissa Chen.